This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, great. So let's get started. I'm really excited to bring what we've been doing to all of you today and to get your feedback. So this semester, a group of 9 graduate students, including myself, designed and carried out a mini review comparing 4 sustainability frameworks. And these pictures that I've put up on this slide actually were the result of Googling these 4 frameworks. So you can see on the left side here, these 2 came from Googling agroecology. The top middle 2 were from sustainable intensification. The top right one here was regenerative agriculture, and this bottom middle one was climate smart agriculture. So those are the 4 frameworks that we worked on comparing. And the motivation for these discussions and conversations really came out of discussions with my lab group, which includes my advisor, Andy McDonald, Professor David Rossiter, Sonam Sherpa, Emily Urban, and Valentina Rubio. And those last 2 are presenting with me here today. And we were talking about how often these sustainability frameworks have the same overarching goals, but have very different and sometimes contradictory approaches to reaching those goals. I think that we can all agree that there is urgency in the need to transform our global agriculture system to achieve food security, resiliency, equity, and environmental sustainability. But the progress in that direction has been incremental. And we thought this is partly due to competing sustainability frameworks. So we felt there was a need for open dialogue in the academic community to cultivate alliances across sustainability frameworks and across disciplines, and to work together towards shared goals. So it was in this spirit that Emily, Valentina, and I reached out to a group of graduate students to gauge interest in planning a workshop and panel to compare these sustainability frameworks and to identify shared goals. And thankfully, our initial statement of interest was met with enthusiasm from most of the graduate students we reached out to, and that's how we ended up with the group presenting with us today. So just to give you a brief introduction to our group, we put together this Venn diagram to show our diverse academic backgrounds. You can see there's a lot of diversity here, but there's also a lot of overlap. Most of us have some experience in the field of agronomy, and there's also a lot of experience in agricultural extension. We also come from a diverse array of geographic backgrounds in where we've done field work. So each color represents one of the 9 students in our group today, and we've done field work in a lot of different locations. So this really helped to inform our discussions and made our discussions all the more interesting. So what we did in order to compare these frameworks is we developed a set of questions to answer for each framework. And then we answered the questions in a Google sheet, like you can see here. So we have agroecology, sustainable intensification, climate smart agriculture, and regenerative agriculture across the top, and then the questions we answered on the side. And we worked in teams, 2 people on each framework to answer these questions. And we answered them based on the literature. We mainly used review papers, mainly because we tried to make sure that we were using the most prominent version of each framework. So these are the questions that we answered. I won't go through all of them, but we answered questions related to how the framework defines the problem. For example, malnutrition or soil degradation, how they go about solving the problem. And then finally, the framework in use. So who's employing the framework and how do they define it? So after we answered all of these questions, we looked at all of this rubric that we had put together, and we compared compared across frameworks to make sure that all of the answers were comparable. And then we held two 2-hour workshops to discuss our results. So just to get started today, I'm going to give some broad definitions of the frameworks. We tried to pick the most common definitions that are given in published journal articles. So for agroecology, it's often defined as a science, a set of practices, and a social movement. As a science, it's the application of ecological concepts to agricultural systems. As a set of practices, it aims to improve agroecosystems by harnessing natural processes. And as a social movement, it identifies corporate industrial agriculture as the source of current challenges like malnutrition and soil degradation, and it seeks to build locally relevant food systems. And here I just wanted to mention that one of the largest leaders in this social movement realm is La Via Campesina, which represents 200 million smallholder farmers across the world. Then for sustainable intensification, the definition that is most often seen in the literature always refers to increasing productivity and while minimizing environmental costs. And we also see reference to progressing towards substantial enhancement of environmental outcomes. But really the crux of this framework, it always comes back to avoiding cultivation of more land. So it fits within the Landsparing approach, if you're familiar with the Landsparing, Landsharing dichotomy. And then for climate smart agriculture, it's defined in 3 points. The first is sustainably increasing agricultural productivity, then adapting and building resilience to climate change, and finally reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Then for regenerative agriculture, it focuses on soil conservation as the entry point to regenerate and contribute to multiple provisioning, regulating and supporting ecosystem services. And it includes social and economic dimensions as well. So before we move on, I'm going to, oh, sorry, forgot about this slide. So here I'm just gonna show you the development of each of these frameworks. You can see that the agroecology framework has been around for the longest, starting in the fields of biology, zoology, ecology, and crop physiology in the 1930s. And it has expanded to include the ecology of food systems in more recent years. Then agroecology became associated with a set of practices starting in the 1960s. And then starting in the 1970s is when it became associated with a social movement. In the 1970s is also when sustainable intensification and regenerative agriculture came about or started being discussed. But it's important to note that regenerative agriculture, there's been a big it's become more popular in recent years. And then climate smart agriculture started in the 2000s. So that's the most recent of the frameworks. So now I'm going to hand it off to Max, who's going to walk you through a fun little game we prepared for all of you.
Thanks, Kira. So here we have some word clouds that we created from Twitter searches of the 4 frameworks. In the word clouds of each framework, the words showing up the most in the tweets appear larger and the less used words appearing smaller. So as you can tell, they don't have labels right now. What we're going to ask you to do in a quick pop-up poll is to try and guess which word cloud corresponds to which framework. And you'll have about a minute to do this.
I just realized none of you can see the results coming in, but I'm watching them, and it's there's 8 of 38 so far. $15, $16. We'll go to, we don't want to let it run for too long. There's 21. Okay, that's enough, I'd say. So I'll share the results. You can all see those?
Yeah, and can you move to the next slide then?
Yes.
There. So it looks like there's a lot of division, and that's kind of the point, is that this is a very tricky exercise. The point of the game is to illustrate the challenge in discussing and comparing these frameworks. As I think Andy had mentioned in the chat before, the division between these frameworks aren't explicit, especially if you're taking it to Twitter discussions. And there's a lot of blending along the edges. Or in the case of these Twitter word clouds, kind of the small words, might be where some of the associations are. And the differences between these frameworks are often in the interplay between the priorities and how they are discussed. So on that note, I'll hand it back over to Kiera.
All right, thanks, Max. So next, we're going to walk you through some key highlights from our discussions, and we'll have different members of our group present each highlight. And then after that, we have some discussion questions to pose to all of you, and we'll put you into breakout rooms. So just keep that in mind while we go through these key highlights, that you may want to take notes and just keep track of what you're thinking as we go through it, because you might want to discuss it in your breakout room. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Rink to walk us through the first highlight.
Hi everyone, my name is Rink Takuma and I'm in the Animal Science department. And so we wanted to introduce you here to the first key discussion point, and that is presenting the highest level goals that exist within the four frameworks. And then Emily Baker will follow me, who will then outline some of the key differences that we found between the focus of the four frameworks. So to begin with, the key goal for all of these frameworks is to ultimately improve food security and human nutrition, whilst at the same time reducing environmental effects caused by agriculture, including like soil degradation, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and so on. And so, although we found that these are the common goals that exist within each framework, we also looked at the differences, the key focus of differences, and these will be explained by Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Baker. I'm over in development sociology. And this, I think, was actually one of the points that we had a lot of interesting conversation and some serious debate about. Because there are a lot of similarities in the frameworks, we wanted to try and pull out sort of like a kind of one key leading idea per framework, almost like sort of like your bumper sticker for that framework. So, we recognize that these frameworks are complex, and there's a lot that goes into each of them. But if we're thinking about, say, agroecology, and really in the sort of like current, form of agroecology that incorporates sort of a social movement component of it, and thinking about, maybe more than food security, even food sovereignty, this idea of equity sort of comes to the fore in defining agroecology from that, not just the ecology of agriculture, but also agroecology as a social movement. In terms of sustainable intensification, we are talking about, sort of like how do we increase production without creating more adverse harm to the environment. So it does, we're thinking that sustainable intensification does center the productivity framework. For climate smart agriculture, of course, we've got climate, and thinking about how do we adapt our food systems to changing, changing environmental patterns. And then for regenerative agriculture, sort of thinking that soil health is leading the charge for how we think about that framework. So those are just some of the, almost thinking about them in terms of, you know, the bumper stickers that have a lot behind them besides just those single words.
Great. Thanks, Emily and Rink. My name is Augustine, and I'm also in the Animal Science Department. And kind of the second highlight we wanted to share with all of you was that some of the practices or several of the practices when we look at the field level are very similar across frameworks, but not all of them. So what we basically did here was to try to look at that at the field level practices and compare them across all these frameworks and try to come up with which are the similarities and differences between different frameworks. And so as you can see here on the screen, we have, like, for the similarities, most of the frameworks or all the frameworks agreed on things like crop diversity and rotation, the use of agroforestry or intercropping, the integration of crop and livestock systems, the use of no-till and the importance of crop residue, and in general, the use of the increase of input use efficiency in general. There were some differences in how much each framework stressed on each of these practices, but we thought pretty much all of them talked about them as things we want to improve or target for. And specifically regarding increased input use efficiency, there were some differences between frameworks if they were stressing more on external inputs or internal inputs. And with that, David, for the differences.
Yeah, so in regards to differences, it's the nature of the external inputs are where key differences exist, and the conversation becomes much more contentious, particularly in regard to pesticides, inorganic fertilizer use, and germplasm sources in development. Broadly speaking, CSA and sustainable intensification do not discriminate regarding external inputs as long as they fit within a range of best management practices. Some of the proponents of RA, and Emily Urban will discuss this next, and many in agroecology discriminate strongly against external inputs. And we should just note that, as Kiara noted earlier, that this review focused only on journal articles. So at the farmer level or NGO level, the application of these sustainability frameworks may be agnostic with respect to external inputs, or it may be much more monotheistic in terms of what they accept or do not accept. And I'll turn it over to Emily Urban now.
Hi, everyone. Kiara, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. There we go. Super. I'm Emily Urban in Soil and Crop Sciences. And the third highlight of our discussions was this high variability within each framework. And this actually made things fairly difficult to compare. Now, sometimes we found that depending on the framework, we found more differences within the framework than between different frameworks. And we've kind of concluded that this is happening for a couple of different reasons. First, the definition of a framework shifts with time. And ultimately, for all of these, there's no one single definition. In fact, a good example of this could be regenerative agriculture. It was first mentioned in the late 70s by the Rodale Institute and included components such as the limited use of external inputs. But now we're seeing this term used more and more. It's much more receptive to the use of external inputs and other technologies, and is being used on a variety of scales. So second, we also have different user groups prioritizing or shaping different components of the definitions of these frameworks. Arguably, one of the examples could be agroecology. Agroecology is defined as a scientific discipline, such as practices, social movement, as we heard earlier. And sometimes there's some groups focusing on maybe one of those areas more than others, more than the other three. At the same time, we know there's groups that argue that these three elements can absolutely not be decoupled. So there is that spectrum there. Third, depending on the global context in which these frameworks are applied, thinking of cropping systems, scale, etc., the framework may look differently and take on different foci. For example, sustainable intensification, USAID broadly defines it through a food security lens, looking at increasing productivity while minimizing environmental degradation. But it equally prioritizes elements such as gender, equity, nutrition, thinking of dietary diversity along those lines. But other areas of the world, and perhaps even generalizing to high-income countries, even larger scale farms, SI might take on more of a reduced form. So maybe focused on yields and reducing environmental harm. So there's some variation in that spectrum. So ultimately, we found that to have clear, succinct discussions about these frameworks, that it's really necessary to come to the table with a clear definition of how we are defining each of these frameworks to begin with. I'll pass it on to the fourth and final highlight.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sydney from Development Sociology. As Emily said, it was difficult to find distinct differences between the frameworks because of the variation within them, but we did come up with a few points to report back to you. One main difference was, although all of the frameworks attempt to address food insecurity, the root cause of that food insecurity is emphasized differently. Most of the frameworks say that low productivity is linked to technologies and information not reaching the people the farmers who need them. Whereas agroecology says that the corporate consolidation of the food system and liberalized trade is really causing an increase in livelihood vulnerability for smallholder farmers. And then this leads to the second point. There was disagreement in our group about whether a sustainability framework should have a political component. The next point, which is directly related to this previous one, is that the role of markets in food security was conceptualized differently. So whereas agroecology sees global commodity markets and their vertical integration as the problem for food security, the other frameworks often say that markets are not reaching farmers adequately with the competitive prices and technologies that would support the productivity improvements that could lead to an income pathway to food security. The role of agriculture in environmental conservation is somewhat different between the approaches. As Kira mentioned earlier, the Landsparing approach is seen as important in the sustainable intensification approach, increasing per unit productivity of land, whereas in agroecology, there's wild and cultivated biodiversity is seen as possible to sustain through diversified agricultural plots. And another difference was the relation between agriculture and climate change. In climate smart agriculture, the practices that are used are really supposed to help farmers adapt to changes, the effects of climate change, whereas regenerative agriculture centers the greenhouse gas contribution of agriculture and the potential of carbon sequestration through soil management practices. And then finally, the rationale for changing input usage is different between the frameworks. So SI really speaks to optimizing inputs for productivity, whereas agroecology focuses on reducing dependency on fertilizer for farmer autonomy and ecosystem health.
Okay, great. thank you all for those summaries of our key highlights. Now we're going to go into breakout rooms, which I've just been busy creating. So there are breakout rooms of 5 to 6 people with at least one of us in each room. So there are 7 rooms. And these are the questions that we'd like for you to discuss. You don't have to discuss all of them. The first 2 are more general, and the last 3 are more broad. Oh, sorry, more specific, dig a little deeper. And so we'd like you to pick 1 or 2 questions to discuss in your group. And I'm going to share the link to our slides with all of you in the chat so that you can all see the questions and also review the slides if you want to during your discussion. And we've also included several slides after this you'll see that you can use to take notes on during your discussion. So take note of which breakout room you're in, and that's your group number. And if you're confused, don't worry about it. There'll be 1 or 2 of us in each group. So yeah, with that, I think I will open the breakout rooms.
How long will we have in each room?
Oh yeah, thank you. I knew there was something I was forgetting. 15 minutes. We're gonna have 15 minutes for the discussion, and then we're going to come back for a large group discussion. So yeah, so be prepared. That's another thing. Be prepared to share with the large group when we come back. Okay, looking forward to it. See you, some of you in breakout rooms. All right. I hope everybody had a chance to have some discussion. I noticed too late that 1 or 2 of the breakout rooms only had 3 people, and I'm sorry about that. But I'm excited to hear what you've all been talking about. So, and I think that this worked great to have everybody on the Google Slides doc. So if anybody wants to volunteer to share with the group what their small group talked about, anybody's brave enough.
I can start with some notes from our group. So yeah, and Rachel, Sonoma, Paul, feel free to speak up. But basically, one thing that I mentioned was interesting is that I mentioned to them that we were interested in capturing what the things that were not included in the framework and we probably missed. And some of the thoughts from our group was that the review didn't capture some of the entire aspects or description of agroecology. We mentioned some thoughts on the importance of power dynamics and a more holistic view of the food system when we talked about that specific system and how that differs quite a bit from how SI, for example, was pictured in the review. And then we talked about the differences in the frameworks in terms of scaling up and how some conceptions may think that let us think that some frameworks are easier to scale up than others, when that depends on a lot of things potentially. And some other interesting thoughts was that we pointed initially that for us, all frameworks were talking about food security or had that goal, but some of the thoughts in the group were that probably not all of them in practice were putting actual efforts into ensuring food security. So they were stressing differently in food security. So I guess that's those were some thoughts from our group.
Great, thanks. Those are some good thoughts. Does anybody else want to share what they talked about? Would it be helpful if I shared the slide again with the questions, maybe? Although I like looking at all your faces.
I'm realizing that I don't think we follow one specific question. We went all over the place, but hopefully it was clear.
That's okay. They're just there to inspire.
Well, maybe I can just make a point or two about we had a very wide range of discussion, and two big words that I think maybe Aaliyah can agree with me, were context and history. We thought we got to the end that the situation we're in now has a very big historical background, and you can't look at that in isolation. You have to start from where you are and you got here. And then the solutions could be very context dependent. And maybe the last thing is we talked a lot about scale. If you talk about things like food sovereignty, at what scale do you deal with it? So, I mean, that's enough. We talked about a lot, but those are a few key issues.
Great. Yeah.
Maybe I'll add to David's comments and from our discussion, and I hope I didn't dominate it too much. But I really like the similarities and the differences that you guys pointed out in that one slide. But I think that what's important is to look at the potential conflicts. Like if we say we want to discourage the use of inorganic fertilizers, well, that has a lot of implications. If we're concerned about commodification, well, a lot of the soybean and corn production in the central part of this country keeps a lot of small farmers in India and Western Europe in business, basically. And so if we're thinking about social objectives, then and we want to change some of these things that we're really concerned about, we have to think about the potential conflicts and the potential downstream consequences of that. So each of those four paradigms have good objectives, and we should all kind of try to pursue those. But there are a lot of potential conflicts. There are a lot of potential problems that might emerge by addressing one versus another. Okay, and that's sort of that. I think is something that we discussed at least for a couple of minutes. So it's not that simple.
Why don't you present your group, Kira? And then...
So we talked about the Landsparing versus Landsharing framework and how it's difficult to have both. And that there's not enough science, that we don't know enough to really be able to compare one to the other in terms of how well each does at preserving biodiversity. We also talked about how it doesn't necessarily need to be like one or the other. Like land sharing doesn't have to mean zero inputs. Yeah. And we talked about autonomy. I thought this was really interesting, like the idea of farmer autonomy. Andy brought up in SI and CSA frameworks is more about like farmer choice. And in the AE framework, autonomy is referring more to independence from markets. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting because I think sometimes we can think that farmers have choice, but they don't always, depending on the context that they're working within. But Andy brought up that critical point of view might not be universal. Again, it depends on context. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I feel like we're just at the tip of the iceberg. I wish we had so much more time to talk with all of you, but let me share my screen again. Yeah, we would really like to continue this discussion with you all and with a more diverse audience next semester. And so if you have any suggestions or feedback, or you're interested in getting involved with planning for future discussions, I'd encourage you to email me. My email is on that slide there. And yeah, I think it's really important to have these interdisciplinary conversations and to hear what, people within our college, but on different sides of campus are thinking, and to give merit to what everybody is working on and thinking about. So thank you all very much for attending, And I think that we'll end it there for people who need to leave, but if anybody wants to stay on to chat further, then you're welcome to. I'll hang out for a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kira, and really a deep thanks to the group for sticking with this all semester. I don't know how many hours you guys have spent in discussion on these issues. Quite a number, if the report backs are accurate, and I think that they are. So thank you very much. It's such a complex area to think through and certainly to reach consensus on.
Yeah.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.